I will condense the study described in the poster presentation. I received funding for my PhD to conduct a follow-up study tracing a cohort of young deaf people who were involved in a research study 20 years ago. To date, there has been no longitudinal study into the long-term well-being outcomes of a deaf population. The funding was provided to conduct a follow-up study to trace the original cohort and measure their well-being outcomes over a period of 20 years to determine whether their well-being was the same, and if not, what factors from childhood may have influenced the well-being outcomes. Measuring well-being necessitated using standardised assessment tools. However, the instruments are designed both linguistically and culturally for a hearing population. There are no mental health instruments in British Sign Language. We were therefore required to translate the existing instruments into sign language to ensure they were both linguistically and culturally appropriate for the deaf community. This poster presentation focuses on one part of the PhD project, the translation process of the assessment tool to ensure equivalence between the BSL and the English versions. Furthermore, this was piloted on a general deaf population and not the original cohort. The aim of the pilot was to determine how feasible it is to use either the BSL version and or the English version with a deaf population using the clinical outcomes and routine evaluation outcome measures, commonly referred to as CORE-OM. The pilot study, as you can see in this poster presentation, found that the BSL version was reliable, and overall the English version completed by deaf people seemed so too. However, if you look more closely at all the items, and there are 4 domains within the CORE-OM, the domains of risk and functionality scored significantly lower. This means that professionals working with deaf people need to be cautious of using the mental health assessments that have been standardised with hearing populations when working with deaf people.
I'm looking at has come from a very specific problem. I'm a genetic counsellor by background, and for the last 8 or 9 years I've particularly specialised in deafness, both seeing people to talk about the causes of deafness in their family, but particularly I've got responsibility for thinking about how we can improve the service in terms of access and communication for deaf people. And that could be people who've lost their hearing later on, or people who were born deaf. And that's the area of research I'm looking at for my PhD. So I realised through working with some BSL interpreters in the service when we were trying to translate some leaflets into BSL that genetic terminology is evolving so fast, it's such a fast-changing area and obviously highly technical, that there was a time lag in terms of the signs developing in BSL, and that's not unusual to BSL. It's the same in many other community languages. The practical resources we aim to come out with are much better online resources, predominantly in BSL, about genetics, genetic counselling, that can be used by genetic colleagues, but more broadly by health professionals and also by other professionals, perhaps teachers, social care professionals who are working with deaf people and want access to this information. I mean, if people aren't familiar with sign language, they quite often think it matches English in terms of word order, and that it's an artificial language, a bit like Braille, for example, is a tactile representation of English, and it's not. BSL and other sign languages evolve just the same as English, and they take words on depending on things that move. So Google is in the general lingua franca now, but this is a sign for Google. There's a sign in BSL, and that's come in the last few years. So it's just the same in any technical language. It will evolve depending on the cultural pressures, the semantic pressures. New technology drives the way that languages develop. But what's really interesting about sign language as well is that it's not just about words, it's about how the words interrelate. And I know you were interviewing my colleague Katie, who's deaf and a BSL user, and you can see from watching her signing that, you know, you're not just using words here, you're using words here, you're relating words to each other. So this is the sign that people often use for chromosome, and sometimes in the past people have used that for gene as well. But actually people often use this as chromosome and this is gene, which shows how the genes are lined up along the chromosome. So it takes full advantage of, you know, being able to paint a picture visually almost and show how things are related to each other in 3 dimensions as well.